She thought she was protecting the rules of the school, but in less than 10 seconds, the entire hallway would learn the difference between authority and respect. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. Now, back to Sarah Bennett. The late afternoon sun stretched through the tall windows of Lincoln Heights Middle School, painting long golden rectangles across the polished hallway floors as students hurried toward buses, lockers slammed shut, and teachers gathered papers before heading home. The familiar sounds of an American school winding down for the day echoed through the building with comforting rhythm and routine. Then the front doors opened and Sarah Bennett stepped quietly inside, carrying a canvas tote bag over one shoulder. At 38 years old, the white woman looked more like a parent waiting for a conference than someone whose decisions would soon affect every classroom in the district. She wore a simple gray sweater, blue jeans, and white sneakers that had clearly been chosen for comfort rather than appearance. Her blonde hair rested loosely against her shoulders, and her expression carried the calm patience of someone accustomed to listening more than speaking. She paused near the visitor desk and glanced toward the framed photographs lining the walls. Robotics champions, debate teams, graduation ceremonies. Thousands of students had built memories inside these halls. Sarah smiled softly. Schools had always felt like places where possibilities began. Across the corridor, Assistant Principal Linda Foster noticed her immediately. Linda had spent nearly 20 years maintaining order inside Lincoln Heights, and experience had taught her to identify visitors quickly. Parents checked in at the office. Vendors wore identification badges. Maintenance crews arrived through service entrances. Yet the woman standing alone near the hallway somehow did not fit neatly into any category Linda recognized. Sarah checked the time on her watch. Her meeting had been scheduled for 3:30. There was still plenty of time. She adjusted the strap of her tote bag and took a few steps toward the administrative offices just as a group of students rushed past laughing on their way toward the parking lot. One student accidentally brushed against her shoulder before immediately apologizing. Sarah smiled warmly. "No harm done," she replied. The student smiled back before disappearing through the doors with his friends. Linda watched the exchange from across the hallway with growing suspicion rather than reassurance. The school had strict visitor policies. Everyone knew that. She walked towards Sarah with measured steps, her heels echoing sharply against the polished floor beneath the fluorescent lights overhead. Around them, conversations slowly quieted as teachers gathered folders against their chests and students slowed their pace just enough to watch what was happening. Sarah turned as Linda approached and offered a polite smile. Linda did not return it. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said firmly. "Can you tell me why you are walking through this school without authorization?" The hallway grew quieter still. Somewhere in the distance, a locker door closed with a metallic echo that seemed louder than it should have been. Sarah remained calm. She had no idea that within the next few moments, this ordinary school hallway was about to become a place none of them would ever forget. Sarah Bennett met Linda Foster's gaze without the slightest hint of irritation. "I have a meeting scheduled with the district office team at 3:30, she replied calmly. "I arrived a few minutes early and was heading toward administration." Linda crossed her arms. "Visitors are required to check in at the front office immediately upon entering the building." Sarah nodded politely. "Of course. I was actually looking for the office when we spoke." The explanation was simple, reasonable, and entirely truthful. Somehow it only seemed to deepen Linda's certainty that she was dealing with someone who believed rules existed for other people. Years of responsibility had sharpened her instincts, but somewhere along the way instinct had slowly become assumption. "Do you have identification with you?" Linda asked. Sarah reached toward her tote bag. "Certainly." Before she could retrieve anything, Linda raised a hand slightly. "Please leave your bag where it is for the moment." The request was not hostile, but it carried enough authority that several nearby students slowed their steps even further. A science teacher standing beside a classroom doorway glanced over briefly before pretending to reorganize papers that clearly did not need organizing. Human curiosity had always traveled quickly through school hallways. Sarah lowered her hand and simply nodded. "That is fine." Linda studied her for another moment. "What district office meeting are you referring to exactly?" Sarah smiled faintly. "I believe Superintendent Hayes will be able to explain that better than I can." The answer was intended as courtesy rather than mystery. Linda interpreted it differently. So you cannot explain why you are here. Sarah remained perfectly composed. I can explain. I simply thought it might be more appropriate coming from him. A few students exchanged looks nearby. One whispered something to a friend before quickly falling silent again. Linda noticed and straightened slightly. Public confidence often grew stronger in front of an audience. This is a school, Mrs. Sarah answered gently. Bennett. Sarah Bennett. Linda nodded once. Mrs. Bennett, this is a school, not a public waiting room. Security procedures exist for a reason. The hallway became noticeably quieter. Even the fluorescent lights overhead suddenly seemed louder than the conversations around them. Sarah stood quietly for a moment before speaking again. I completely agree with security procedures. Schools should feel safe for students and staff. Linda appeared almost surprised by the answer. She had expected defensiveness, maybe frustration, possibly embarrassment. Instead, she found herself speaking to someone whose calm somehow made the situation feel larger rather than smaller. Then perhaps you understand why I need to ask you to remain here until we verify your presence in the building. Sarah nodded once more. That seems reasonable. Across the hallway, two students sitting near the trophy case lowered their voices and continued watching openly now. Near the office doors, a secretary had quietly stopped typing altogether. Linda reached for the radio attached to her belt. Mr. Collins, could you come to the east hallway for visitor assistance? The radio crackled softly with confirmation. Sarah glanced down at her watch and then back toward Linda. Her expression never changed. That will probably not be necessary, she said quietly. Linda frowned slightly. Excuse me. Sarah looked at the second hand moving steadily around the watch face. Because in about 10 seconds, I think this conversation is going to feel very different for everyone standing here. The hallway went silent. For a moment, nobody moved. The second hand on Sarah Bennett's watch continued its steady circle while the hallway held its breath around her. Linda Foster folded her arms a little tighter and allowed herself a small smile that carried more confidence than amusement. Are we expecting someone important? She asked. Sarah looked up from her watch and met her eyes calmly. Yes. Linda nodded slowly. I see. Around them, the audience had quietly grown. A pair of 8th graders lingered near the trophy case pretending to examine championship banners from years past. A math teacher paused beside a classroom door with a stack of papers pressed against his chest. Even the secretary near the administration office had stepped into the hallway now. Schools had always been communities built on curiosity as much as education. The radio on Linda's belt crackled softly. Mr. Collins is on his way. Sarah simply nodded. Understood. 3 seconds passed. Then 4. Linda glanced briefly toward the main entrance, as if expecting nothing at all to happen. 5 seconds. 6. Somewhere outside, tires rolled slowly across the circular driveway near the front of the building. 7 seconds. 8. The front doors opened. Conversation stopped almost immediately. Superintendent Robert Hayes entered the building alongside 3 members of the district leadership team and 2 school board representatives carrying folders and tablets against their sides. Linda straightened immediately. Every educator in the district knew Robert Hayes. His arrival alone was unusual. His arrival with the entire transition committee was almost unheard of. The superintendent's eyes moved across the hallway only briefly before settling on a single person. Sarah Bennett. His expression brightened instantly. Sarah, he said warmly as he crossed the floor toward her. I was afraid traffic had delayed you. The hallway went completely silent. Robert Hayes extended his hand, and Sarah shook it with the easy familiarity of colleagues rather than strangers meeting for the first time. Only by a few minutes, she replied with a smile. Robert glanced toward Linda and the gathering crowd before looking back to Sarah with mild confusion. Has there been some sort of issue? Sarah hesitated for only a moment. Nothing serious. Assistant Principal Foster was making sure school policy was being followed. Linda felt the words land with unexpected weight. Sarah had offered her protection rather than exposure. Robert nodded approvingly. Security matters, especially in schools. Then he smiled and gestured toward the district team standing behind him. Everyone, I would like you to officially meet Dr. Sarah Bennett, our new Executive Director of Educational Innovation and Student Success for the entire district. The words seemed to settle over the hallway in layers. One student lowered his phone slowly back into his pocket. The math teacher near the classroom doorway blinked twice. The secretary near the office quietly covered her mouth with her hand. Linda stood perfectly still. Robert continued speaking, unaware of the storm that had occupied the hallway only moments earlier. Dr. Bennett spent the last 10 years redesigning student achievement programs across 3 states. Frankly, we are lucky she agreed to join us. Sarah smiled politely, but said nothing. Across the hallway, the fluorescent lights hummed softly above the silence. Exactly 10 seconds earlier, she had promised the conversation would feel different. Nobody there could argue that she had been wrong. The hallway remained suspended in a silence so complete that even the distant sound of a basketball bouncing somewhere in the gymnasium seemed unusually loud. Superintendent Robert Hayes continued smiling as he spoke with Sarah Bennett, completely unaware that he had just walked into the final moments of a misunderstanding that everyone around him was desperately trying to process. "The board has been excited about this day for months," he said warmly. "Half the district has been asking when they would finally get to meet you." Sarah smiled politely. "I am hoping they will still be excited after they see the amount of work I plan to give them." A few members of the district team laughed quietly. The tension in the hallway shifted slightly, but not for everyone. Linda Foster stood motionless near the administration office, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and realization. She replayed every moment of the previous few minutes with painful clarity. The questions, the assumptions, the tone in her voice when she had said this was not a public waiting room. None of it sounded the same anymore. Robert finally noticed the unusual stillness surrounding them. His eyes moved from the gathered students to the teachers lingering nearby and eventually settled on Linda herself. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently. Before Linda could answer, Sarah spoke first. "Assistant Principal Foster was making sure your schools remain secure and your procedures are followed. Those are responsibilities worth taking seriously." Robert nodded immediately. "They certainly are." Linda looked towards Sarah with visible surprise. Once again, the woman standing in front of her had chosen kindness over advantage. The district team began gathering near the conference room doors while Robert glanced at his watch. "We should probably begin before the board starts wondering where we disappeared to." Then he smiled toward Sarah. "I believe Lincoln Heights will be your first official campus evaluation as executive director." Sarah looked around the hallway slowly. The trophy cases, the classroom doors, the students pretending not to stare, the teachers quietly observing from a distance. "Then I suppose first impressions matter," she replied softly. Robert laughed. "More than most people realize." As the group began moving toward the conference room, Linda finally found her voice. "Dr. Bennett?" Sarah stopped and turned back toward her. For a moment, Linda seemed uncertain how to continue. Years of leadership experience had prepared her for difficult conversations with parents, students, and faculty members. Somehow this felt harder than all of them. "I owe you an apology." The hallway fell silent once more. Sarah studied her for a moment before offering a small smile. "I think what matters more is what happens next." Linda lowered her eyes briefly before nodding. "You have my word that it will matter to me." Sarah nodded once in return and followed the district team toward the conference room doors. Behind her, students slowly returned to their conversations and teachers resumed their routines, but something in the atmosphere had changed. Because every person standing in that hallway had just witnessed the same lesson unfold in real time. Titles can arrive unexpectedly. Authority can change overnight. But respect should never have to wait for an introduction. The conference room overlooked the football field through wide windows that reflected the fading colors of the afternoon sky across the polished table below. Sarah Bennett took her seat quietly near the center while district leaders arranged folders, laptops, and reports around her. Outside, students drifted toward waiting buses and parents filled the parking lot with the familiar rhythm of another American school day coming to an end. Inside the room, however, the future of an entire district was beginning to take shape. Superintendent Robert Hayes stood near the projector screen and smiled toward the group gathered around him. "For the past 18 months, we have searched for someone capable of helping our schools prepare students for challenges that did not exist 10 years ago," he said. "Today that search officially ends." Sarah lowered her eyes slightly at the praise while several board members nodded in agreement. Across the room, a large display illuminated charts showing student engagement, graduation trends, and literacy growth projections. Sarah studied them carefully for a moment before speaking. Data matters, she said softly. But students remember how schools make them feel long after they forget percentages and graphs. The room grew quiet. Robert smiled immediately. That sentence alone explains why we wanted you here. Meanwhile, outside in the hallway, Linda Foster remained standing near the administration office long after everyone else had returned to work. The school resource officer had already gone back to his normal duties. The students had moved on to after-school activities and sports practices. Even the teachers had returned to lesson planning and grading. Yet Linda could not quite move past the conversation she had replayed in her mind at least 20 times already. She remembered Sarah's patience. She remembered the lack of defensiveness in her voice. Most of all, she remembered how easily kindness could have disappeared from that situation and how deliberately Sarah had chosen not to let that happen. A few minutes later, the conference room door opened and Sarah stepped into the hallway alone, holding a notebook against her side. Linda looked up immediately. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, while distant voices echoed from somewhere near the gymnasium. Finally, Linda broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah smiled gently. "Of course." Linda hesitated before continuing. "When you looked at your watch and said 10 seconds, were you trying to scare me?" Sarah laughed quietly for the first time all afternoon. "No, I was trying to give you a chance to be right." Linda frowned slightly. Sarah continued. "I knew Robert was walking through the front doors because he texted me from the parking lot. I also knew that if you had simply asked me to wait a moment, none of us would be standing here having this conversation." Linda looked down for a moment before nodding slowly. "That is fair." Sarah adjusted the notebook in her hands and smiled once more. "Schools teach lessons every day, Linda. Sometimes adults just happen to be the students." The hallway fell quiet again, and somehow that lesson felt larger than any meeting waiting inside the conference room doors. The meeting continued well into the early evening as ideas moved across the conference table with the energy that only new beginnings seemed to carry. Sarah Bennett listened far more than she spoke, filling pages of notes while principals discussed staffing shortages, teachers shared concerns about student engagement, and board members debated budgets that never seemed large enough for the dreams they hoped to fund. Through the conference room windows, the football field slowly disappeared beneath the soft blue light of approaching dusk. One by one, the voices around the table began turning towards Sarah, waiting to hear what the district's newest leader thought about the challenges ahead. She closed her notebook gently and looked around the room. "Every school has data," she said quietly. "What separates great schools from average ones is whether students feel seen before they are measured." The room fell silent. Robert Hayes smiled immediately. Several principals exchanged thoughtful looks. Sarah continued. "A student who feels invisible rarely performs at their best. The same is true for parents. The same is true for teachers. And sometimes, if we are honest, it is true for visitors standing in our hallways." Nobody needed her to explain what she meant. The lesson had already arrived hours earlier. Across the building, Linda Foster sat alone in her office, staring at the framed certificates and awards that covered one wall beside her desk. 20 years of service, leadership recognition, district excellence awards. She had spent her career protecting students and supporting teachers. Yet somehow one ordinary afternoon had forced her to ask herself a question she had not considered in years. When had caution quietly become judgment? A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to find Sarah standing in the doorway holding her coat and canvas tote bag. "The meeting finally ended," Sarah said with a smile. Linda stood immediately. "How did it go?" Sarah laughed softly. "Ask me again in 6 months." For the first time that day, Linda laughed too. The tension that had lived between them all afternoon seemed to disappear into the quiet office around them. Sarah glanced toward the photographs on the wall and stopped at one showing Linda surrounded by graduating students from years earlier. "You have helped a lot of children leave this building believing in themselves," Sarah said. Linda looked at the photograph and nodded. "I hope so." Sarah adjusted the strap of her bag before heading toward the door. "Then do not let one mistake convince you that is no longer true." Linda looked up quickly. Sarah smiled gently. "Good people make mistakes. Good leaders learn from them." Outside, the parking lot lights flickered on one by one as evening settled over Lincoln Heights Middle School. Sarah crossed the empty sidewalk toward her car while the last school bus disappeared around the corner, and the American flag moved quietly in the breeze above the entrance. Behind her, Linda remained standing in the doorway watching her leave. Because sometimes the most important lesson taught in a school never appears on a test, never hangs on a bulletin board, and never arrives inside a textbook. Sometimes it walks through the front door wearing a gray sweater, carrying a canvas bag, and reminds everyone that respect works best when it arrives before titles do. 3 months later, the hallways of Lincoln Heights Middle School felt different in ways that could not be measured by attendance reports or standardized testing scores. New visitor signs welcomed families before reminding them about procedures. Front office staff greeted parents by name whenever possible. Teachers volunteered to stand near entrances during dismissal simply to answer questions and offer directions. Small changes rarely made headlines, but schools were built on small things repeated consistently over time. On a cool October afternoon, Sarah Bennett returned to Lincoln Heights for a follow-up visit as part of her district responsibilities. The maple trees lining the parking lot had begun turning shades of red and gold, and the crisp air carried the unmistakable feeling of autumn settling across New England. She stepped through the front doors wearing the same simple style she had worn months earlier. Gray sweater, blue jeans, white sneakers, canvas tote bag resting against her shoulder. This time the receptionist smiled the moment she saw her. "Good afternoon, Dr. Bennett. Welcome back." Sarah smiled warmly in return. "Thank you. It is good to be back." As she walked through the hallway, several teachers nodded politely while students moved past carrying backpacks and armfuls of textbooks. Near the trophy case, a young mother stood holding the hand of a nervous sixth grader who was clearly visiting the school for the first time. The woman looked uncertain as she glanced around the unfamiliar building. Before Sarah could say anything, Linda Foster appeared beside them. "Welcome to Lincoln Heights," Linda said kindly. "Can I help you find where you need to go?" The mother smiled with visible relief. "My son is transferring here next week, and we are a little lost." Linda laughed softly. "Then you are exactly where you need to be." Sarah watched the interaction quietly from a few feet away. There was no performance in Linda's voice. No obligation. Just kindness offered before credentials were requested. Linda noticed Sarah standing nearby and smiled. "I think I am finally getting better at first impressions." Sarah returned the smile. "I think you are getting better at something even more important." Linda tilted her head slightly. "What is that?" Sarah looked toward the mother and her son walking comfortably down the hallway beside one of the counselors. "Making people feel like they belong before they have to prove they deserve to." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Around them, lockers opened and closed while conversations drifted through the building with the familiar energy of another school day in progress. Linda looked down the hallway and nodded slowly. "You know, I still think about those 10 seconds sometimes." Sarah laughed quietly. "So do I." Linda smiled. "Funny thing is, I used to think the important part of that day was what happened after the 10 seconds ended." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "And now?" Linda looked around the school she had spent 2 decades protecting. "Now I think the important part was who you chose to be during the 10 seconds before they did." The hallway fell quiet around them for just a moment, and somehow that answer felt exactly right. Later that afternoon, Sarah Bennett and Linda Foster stood together near the library entrance as students flowed through the hallway carrying instruments for band practice, science projects balanced carefully in their arms, and backpacks that seemed almost larger than some of the children carrying them. The ordinary rhythm of school life moved around them with quiet certainty. Sarah glanced toward the library windows where a small group of students worked together around a table covered with notebooks and laptops. "Do you know what I love most about schools?" she asked softly. Linda smiled. "I have a feeling you are about to tell me." Sarah laughed quietly. "Every hallway contains futures nobody can predict yet." Linda followed her gaze toward the students. "Future doctors." "Maybe." Sarah nodded. "Future engineers, teachers, artists, business owners, scientists, parents, community leaders." She paused for a moment. "And some of them are probably going to spend years being underestimated before the world catches up with who they really are." Linda looked down the hallway thoughtfully. "I suppose schools are full of people who have not become themselves yet." Sarah smiled. "Exactly." At that moment, a young boy carrying a violin case stopped near the visitor sign beside the office doors and looked uncertainly between 2 hallways. Before he could say anything, Linda walked over immediately. "Looking for the music room?" she asked kindly. The boy nodded. I am new here. Linda pointed toward the west wing with a reassuring smile. Second hallway on your left. Mr. Donnelly is already setting up for rehearsal. The boy smiled with visible relief before hurrying away. Sarah watched quietly from across the hallway. Linda noticed the expression on her face and raised an eyebrow. What? Sarah shook her head slightly. Nothing. I was just thinking that 3 months ago you probably would have asked for identification first. Linda laughed out loud for perhaps the first time since they had met. That is fair. The laughter faded into comfortable silence between them. Outside the windows, autumn sunlight reflected across the parking lot while leaves drifted slowly past the entrance doors. Linda folded her arms and leaned lightly against the wall beside the trophy case. You know something else changed after that day? Sarah looked at her curiously. Parents started talking differently during meetings. Teachers became more patient during difficult conversations. Even students seemed more willing to give each other the benefit of the doubt. Sarah considered that for a moment. Culture spreads faster than policy ever will. Linda nodded slowly. I think kindness does too. The final dismissal bell echoed through the building and voices filled the hallways once again as students moved toward buses and waiting parents. Sarah picked up her tote bag and glanced toward the front doors. I should probably get going. Linda walked with her toward the entrance before stopping beneath the same fluorescent lights where everything had started months earlier. For a moment, both women looked at the spot where time had seemed to stop for 10 unforgettable seconds. Then Linda smiled quietly. Funny how an ordinary hallway can become a place you remember forever. Sarah looked around the school one last time before smiling back. Sometimes the places that teach us the biggest lessons are not classrooms at all. Spring arrived quietly at Lincoln Heights Middle School. The snow that had covered the athletic fields through January had disappeared beneath fresh green grass, and the trees surrounding the parking lot had begun filling with leaves once again. Nearly a year had passed since the afternoon, when 10 seconds changed far more than anyone expected. Inside the building, student artwork lined the hallways beside college acceptance letters, science fair awards, and photographs from school events that celebrated accomplishments both large and small. Schools were always changing because the children inside them were always becoming someone new. On a warm Thursday afternoon, Sarah Bennett returned to Lincoln Heights one final time before summer break to review district progress reports and visit classrooms she had helped support throughout the year. As she stepped through the front entrance carrying her familiar canvas tote bag, the receptionist smiled immediately. Good afternoon, Dr. Bennett. Sarah smiled back. Good afternoon, Martha. Across the hallway, Linda Foster emerged from the administration office holding a folder and laughed softly. You know you have officially become part of this building when the office staff knows your coffee order. Sarah smiled. That may be the most impressive accomplishment of my career. Together, they walked through the hallways as students prepared projects, teachers decorated bulletin boards for graduation season, and parents moved through the building with the comfortable confidence of people who knew they belonged there. Near the trophy case, Sarah noticed a small plaque mounted beside the visitor sign that had not been there before. She stepped closer and read the inscription quietly. Welcome first. Verify second. Respect always. Sarah looked toward Linda with surprise. Linda shrugged slightly. The Student Leadership Committee wrote it after hearing the story. Sarah ran her fingers gently along the edge of the plaque. That is a remarkable lesson for middle school students to understand. Linda smiled. I think children understand kindness long before adults sometimes do. They continued walking until they reached the same stretch of hallway where everything had started so many months earlier. The fluorescent lights still hummed softly overhead. The trophy case still reflected the afternoon sunlight. Lockers still opened and closed with familiar echoes. The hallway looked exactly the same. Somehow it felt completely different. Linda stopped and looked around for a moment. I used to think leadership meant making sure nobody ever made mistakes. Sarah listened quietly. Linda continued. Now I think leadership means making sure mistakes become lessons instead of habits. Sarah smiled gently. That may be one of the smartest things anyone in this district has said all year. Outside the windows, students crossed the parking lot toward waiting parents and yellow school buses lined up beneath the afternoon sun. Another school year was ending. Another group of children was moving one step closer to becoming whoever they would someday be. Sarah adjusted the strap of her canvas bag and turned toward the exit. Before stepping outside, She looked back one final time at the hallway that had changed so many lives, including her own in ways she never expected. Some people spend years trying to teach others about dignity, respect, and compassion. Sometimes all it takes is 10 seconds and the courage to remain kind while the world decides who it thinks you are. And on that ordinary American afternoon, inside an ordinary school hallway, everyone remembered that respect should never arrive after titles do. It should arrive first.